The college kid next door keeps looking through my window, so I showed him my truth, something I didn't even fully understand about myself. What happens when an innocent glance turns into a dangerous connection that threatens to unravel everything? Join me as I share how one spark of attention changed the course of my life forever. Subscribe for more captivating stories, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and made a decision. Grabbing a pitcher of lemonade from the fridge, I stepped outside into the heat of the afternoon. Nathan didn't flinch. He didn't pretend to be surprised to see me, nor did he look away. Instead, he smiled, a boyish, lopsided grin that sent a strange thrill through me. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice warm and teasing, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Call me Julia," I said, the words coming out more smoothly than I expected. I held up the pitcher. "Thought you might need a break from all that yard work." He laughed, setting down the empty watering can he'd been holding like a prop in a stage play. "You caught me," he admitted. "Honestly, I'm just out here for the fresh air." "And the view?" I countered, raising an eyebrow. It was bold, a step over a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross, but the flicker of surprise and amusement in his eyes told me I wasn't alone in towing that line. "The view's not bad," he replied, his tone light but layered. "Thanks for noticing." I set the pitcher on the small patio table between our yards and sat down, gesturing for him to join me. Nathan didn't hesitate. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who knew his presence wasn't unwelcome. His closeness was disarming, the air between us charged with something I hadn't felt in years, something I couldn't name. "How is college life treating you?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation into safer waters. He shrugged. "It's fine. Classes are good, but the town's a little quiet. Not much to do except, well," he paused, and the corner of his mouth quirked up. "Water the grass." "And stare at your neighbor's kitchen window," I said, surprising myself with the playful edge in my voice. Nathan's cheeks flushed, but he didn't look away. "Caught me again," he said softly. "But can you blame me?" "Nay." I should have been scandalized. I should have stood up, excused myself, and gone back inside. But instead, I laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in what felt like forever. "You're trouble," I said, shaking my head. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. "I think you like a little trouble." Eesh. The words hung between us, daring me to react. The warmth of the sun on my skin was nothing compared to the heat rising in my chest. I stood abruptly, the scrape of my chair loud in the silence. "I should get back to making dinner," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Nathan stood too, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for the lemonade," he said, his tone genuine. "And sorry if I've been a little obvious. I'll stop if it bothers you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I nodded and turned to leave. But as I stepped inside, I glanced over my shoulder and found him watching me again. Not with arrogance or malice, but with a quiet intensity that lingered long after I closed the door. That evening, as I sat alone at the dinner table, Nathan's words replayed in my mind. "I think you like a little trouble." Maybe he was right. Maybe I did. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the air between our homes felt different. I avoided the kitchen window, afraid of what I might see or feel if I caught him looking again. But I couldn't stop myself from thinking about him, from wondering what it was about his gaze that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. On Friday afternoon, I was folding laundry when I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt for no reason I could justify. When I opened the door and found Nathan standing there holding a toolbox, my pulse quickened. "Mrs. Julia," he corrected himself quickly, "I noticed your fence gate was sagging a little. Thought I'd fix it for you, if that's okay." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. He shifted his weight, his confidence wavering for the first time. "I mean, it's no big deal," he added. "Just thought it might be helpful." "So, sure," I said, stepping aside. "Thank you." As he worked, I watched from the patio, trying not to let my gaze linger too long on the way his shirt clung to his back, or the easy strength in his movements. When he finished, he stood and wiped his hands on his jeans, flashing me that same lopsided grin. "All done. Should swing just fine now." "Thank you, Nathan," I said, meaning it. "Let me at least make you a drink." He hesitated, then nodded. "That'd be great." I poured 2 glasses of iced tea and brought them outside, where we sat on the patio again, the air between us as charged as ever. This time it was Nathan who broke the silence. "You know," he said, swirling the ice in his glass, "I don't mean to make you uncomfortable. I just like talking to you. You're easy to be around." And his honesty caught me off guard. "Thank you," I said, my voice soft. "That's nice to hear." There was a pause while his hand moved from my hip. We sat there for a while, the silence between us no longer awkward, but almost companionable. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the yard in shades of gold, I realized I wasn't ready to let this moment end. The weekend came, bringing with it a quiet loneliness that had become all too familiar. Mark's text messages were brief and impersonal, updates about meetings and flights with a perfunctory "hope you're doing well" tacked at the end. I spent Saturday tidying up the house, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that had started to root themselves deeper in my mind. Nathan, of course, didn't make it any easier. I spotted him in his yard that afternoon, shirtless as he worked on fixing his bike. The muscles in his back flexed with each movement, his tan skin glistening under the sun. I hated how easily my eyes found him, how I had to fight the urge to call out something casual just to see him look my way. Instead, I kept myself busy in the garden, pretending not to notice when he glanced over. But when I reached for a bag of soil and struggled to lift it, Nathan was suddenly there. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice startlingly close. I straightened, brushing dirt from my gloves. "I've got it," I said, though the truth was I didn't. I walked down to the river. Nathan gave me a knowing smile and didn't wait for permission. He hoisted the bag with ease, carrying it to the spot I had been eyeing. "There," he said, dusting his hands off on his jeans. "Anything else I can help with?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. The truth was, his presence was both a welcome distraction and a dangerous one. "I think that's it," I said finally, keeping my tone light. "But thank you." Nathan didn't move, his gaze lingering on me. "You know," he said slowly, "you don't have to do everything on your own." The comment caught me off guard, and I turned to him, unsure whether to laugh it off or take it seriously. "I'm used to it," I said with a shrug, bending back to my work. "That doesn't mean you should be," he replied, his tone soft but insistent. I straightened again, meeting his eyes. There it was, the same intensity that had unsettled me before, though now it felt less like a challenge and more like a question. Before I could respond, He stepped back, his expression shifting to something more casual. "Anyway," he said, a teasing grin creeping onto his face, "I'll let you get back to it. Call me if you need anything heavy lifted. Or anything at all, really." I laughed despite myself, shaking my head as he walked away. But his words stayed with me long after he was gone. That evening, as the house settled into its usual silence, I found myself by the window, peering into the growing darkness. Nathan's house was quiet, the lights in his room dim. I let out a sigh, chastising myself for letting my thoughts linger on him for even a moment. But then, as if sensing my gaze, his silhouette appeared. He stood by his own window, his figure framed in the soft glow of a desk lamp. For a moment, neither of us moved, the space between our homes suddenly feeling much smaller. Then he raised a hand, a slow, almost tentative wave. I should have walked away, turned off the lights, and gone to bed. Instead, I raised my hand in return, my breath catching as his expression shifted to a quiet smile. It was such a small thing, such a fleeting moment, and yet it set my heart racing in a way I hadn't felt in years. Sunday brought a thunderstorm, the kind that rattled windows and soaked the ground in minutes. I was curled up on the couch with a book when the doorbell rang, the sound unexpected and sharp against the low rumble of thunder. I opened the door to find Nathan standing there, a sheepish smile on his face and raindrops clinging to his hair. "Sorry to bother you," he said, holding up a small flashlight. "Power's out next door, and I was wondering if you had any extra candles." I hesitated, the warmth of his presence both a comfort and a danger. "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Wait here. I'll grab some." I returned with a box of candles and a lighter, but Nathan made no move to leave. Instead, he stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "It's peaceful," he said, his voice quieter now. I followed his gaze, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil inside me. "It is," I agreed, setting the box on the table. "Do you want to wait here until it lets up?" Nathan turned to me, his eyes searching mine as if trying to gauge my meaning. "If you don't mind," he said softly. I didn't mind. That was the problem. We sat on the couch, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the walls. The air between us was heavy with unspoken words, the storm outside muffling the sound of our breaths. Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and spoke without looking at me. "Julia, I hope I'm not crossing a line here, but I feel like I need to say this." He paused, his hands fidgeting slightly. "You're amazing. I mean, the way you carry yourself, the way you handle everything. I just admire you." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. "Nathan, I..." He turned to me then, his eyes steady and filled with something I couldn't name. "I'm not trying to make things complicated," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The weight of his honesty hung in the air, and I found myself searching for the right response. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "That means a lot." We sat in silence after that, the storm outside filling the space between us. I knew I should have sent him home, drawn a clear boundary before things could blur further. But as the rain continued to fall and the candles burned lower, I couldn't bring myself to move. The storm eventually eased, but Nathan didn't rush to leave, and I didn't push him to go. The rain had dwindled to a light patter, and the occasional rumble of thunder felt distant now, less threatening. We remained on the couch, the space between us both insignificant and insurmountable. The flickering candlelight cast warm hues on Nathan's face, accentuating the quiet vulnerability in his expression. "I should probably get going," he said after a long silence, though he made no move to stand. "Probably," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. Neither of us moved. It was as if acknowledging the moment might shatter whatever fragile thread held it together. Instead, I focused on the tiny details, the way his fingers tapped idly against his knee, the way his eyes seemed to flicker like the candlelight itself. "Nathan," I began, the words catching in my throat. This isn't a good idea." He turned to me then, his gaze steady. "I know," he said simply. "But sometimes the right thing feels impossible to do." His words hung in the air, daring me to respond. But before I could find the courage or the wisdom to speak, he stood, taking the candles and lighter with him. "Thank you, Julia," he said, his voice gentle, "for everything." And then he was gone, leaving behind an ache I didn't know how to name. The following days were a blur of avoidance. I kept myself busy with errands, long walks, and anything that would keep me away from the house during the times I might run into Nathan. But no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, his presence lingered, an unshakable memory that clung to the edges of my thoughts. It didn't help that Mark's texts became even shorter, his calls more infrequent. When he did call, his voice was distracted, distant, as if he were talking to a colleague instead of his wife. I tried to muster the courage to tell him how I felt, to explain the emptiness that had crept into our marriage like a shadow. But every time I opened my mouth, the words refused to come. One afternoon, while I was out trimming the hedges, I heard Nathan's voice behind me. "Hey, Julia." I froze, my heart racing. Slowly I turned to face him. He stood on the other side of the fence, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Hi, Nathan," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. I hesitated, glancing toward the house, as if Mark might miraculously appear and save me from whatever this conversation was about to become. But the driveway was empty, the curtains still, and I knew I was on my own. "Okay," I said finally, setting down the clippers. I walked to the gate and opened it, gesturing for him to come through. He stepped inside, his movements slow, almost cautious, as if he were afraid of startling me. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he began, his voice earnest. "But I also can't pretend like nothing's happened." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling heavily on my chest. "Nathan, you're a great guy, but I'm married." "I know that," he said quickly. "And I'm not asking you to leave your husband or anything crazy like that. I feel like there's something here, and I think you feel it too." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze, because the truth was, I did feel it. I felt it in the way my pulse quickened when he was near, in the way his words lingered long after he was gone. But admitting that felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to face. "Nathan," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't know what you want me to say." I just want you to be honest," he replied, his tone quiet but firm. "With me. With yourself." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Honesty. The one thing I'd been avoiding, not just with Nathan, but with Mark, and with myself. That night, I stayed up long after the house had gone dark, sitting by the window and staring out at the quiet street. The moonlight cast a pale glow on Nathan's house, and I wondered if he was awake too, wrestling with the same turmoil that kept me from sleeping. Finally, I reached for my phone and dialed Mark's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy. "Julia, is everything okay?" "I don't know," I admitted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I don't think it is." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought he might hang up. But then he sighed, the sound heavy with exhaustion. "What do you mean?" "Facing her. I mean, I feel like we're drifting apart," I said, my voice cracking. "Like I'm not even part of your life anymore." Mark was silent for so long that I thought the call had dropped, but then he spoke, his tone careful. "Julia, I know I've been distant. Work has been a lot, but I didn't realize you felt this way." "Well, I do," I said, the tears I'd been holding back finally spilling over. "And I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending like everything's fine." Mark sighed again, and when he spoke, his voice was softer. "I'm sorry, Julia. I'll do better. I promise." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. The next day I saw Nathan in the yard again, but this time I didn't avoid him. I walked over to the fence, my heart pounding as I met his gaze. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady, "for making me realize what I needed to do." He nodded, a small, bittersweet smile on his face. "I'm glad I could help." And just like that, the unspoken tension between us seemed to ease, replaced by something softer, something almost like closure. The days that followed were quieter, but not in the oppressive way they had been before. Mark called more often, sometimes just to check in or share something trivial about his day. It wasn't a perfect fix. He was still busy and I was still lonely, but his effort was a balm, a small reminder that he cared. Nathan, however, seemed to fade into the background. He waved politely when we crossed paths, but his demeanor had shifted. The easy confidence he once carried was now tempered, careful, as if he was trying to honor the boundaries I'd set. I thought that distance would bring clarity, but it only seemed to magnify my confusion. I missed our conversations, the way he made me feel seen and valued in a way I hadn't felt in years. And yet, I knew that longing wasn't fair. To Mark, to Nathan, or to myself. One evening, as I was tidying up the patio, Nathan appeared at the gate, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His presence was unexpected, but not unwelcome, though my heart quickened at the sight of him. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Can we talk for a minute?" I hesitated, glancing back toward the house as if Mark might materialize out of thin air. But he was still at work, and the setting sun bathed the yard in a warm, golden light that felt strangely intimate. "Sure," I said, setting down the watering can. "What's on your mind?" Nathan stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry if I made things harder for you. That was never my intention." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "You didn't make things harder," I said finally. "If anything, you helped me realize how much I needed to address in my life." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I'm glad to hear that. But I also want you to know that I meant everything I said about how I feel." The confession hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My breath caught, and I felt my resolve waver. But then I remembered the promise I'd made to myself to fix what was broken in my marriage, to not let my loneliness lead me astray. "Nathan," I said, my voice trembling, "you're a wonderful person, and I'll always be grateful for the connection we've shared. But it can't go any further." He looked up then, his eyes filled with a mix of understanding and hurt. "I know," he said quietly, "and I respect that. I just needed you to know." I nodded, my chest tight with a sadness I couldn't fully explain. "Thank you for being honest, for everything." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Nathan took a step back, his expression softening. "I should go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Take care of yourself, Julia." "You too," I replied, my heart aching as I watched him walk away. That night, Mark came home earlier than usual, a bouquet of flowers in hand. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than I could put into words. We sat down for dinner together, a rare occurrence, and for the first time in months, the conversation felt natural, unforced. "How was your day?" he asked, his tone genuine. I hesitated, the weight of my interactions with Nathan still fresh in my mind. "It was reflective," I said carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what we need to work on." Mark set down his fork, his brow furrowing. "I know I've been distant," he admitted, "and I hate that I've made you feel this way, but I want to fix it, Julia. I really do." His sincerity was evident, and for the first time in a long time I felt a glimmer of hope. "I want to fix it too," I said, my voice steady. "But it's going to take effort, from both of us." He nodded, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The moment felt like a turning point, a chance to rebuild what had been fractured. And while I knew it wouldn't be easy, I also knew it was worth fighting for. The weeks that followed were a slow but steady process of rebuilding. Mark made a conscious effort to be more present, and I worked on being more open about my feelings. There were still moments of tension, but we faced them together, determined to move forward. Nathan, meanwhile, remained a quiet presence in the background of my life. I saw him occasionally, working in his yard, jogging in the early mornings. But we kept our interactions brief and polite. It was a painful but necessary distance, one that allowed me to focus on my marriage without the distraction of what might have been. One afternoon, as I was sitting on the patio with a book, Nathan approached the fence. He hesitated, his hands gripping the wooden slats as if unsure whether to speak. "Hi," he said finally, his voice cautious. "Hi," I replied, setting the book aside. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I just wanted to say goodbye. I'm moving back to campus next week." The news hit me harder than I expected, though I wasn't sure why. "Oh," I said, my voice faltering. That's great. I hope it goes well." "Thanks," he said, his gaze steady. "And I hope things work out for you too, with Mark." I nodded, my throat tight. "Thank you, Nathan, for everything." He smiled again, this time more genuine. "Take care, Julia." "You too," I said, watching as he walked away for the last time. As the seasons changed, so did my life. Mark and I continued to work on our marriage, and while it wasn't perfect, it was stronger than it had been in years. The lessons I'd learned during those fleeting moments with Nathan stayed with me, a reminder of the importance of connection and honesty. And though I sometimes caught myself glancing toward the empty house next door, I knew that chapter of my life was over. It had been a brief, bittersweet moment in time, a spark that illuminated the cracks in my world and helped me find the strength to repair them. In the end, I was grateful for Nathan, for the clarity he brought, and for the chance to rebuild what truly mattered. Months passed, and the air of change that Nathan's departure had sparked seemed to settle into every corner of my life. Mark and I were no longer navigating our marriage on autopilot. It wasn't easy. Old habits and patterns took time to break, but there was a renewed sense of effort between us, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were truly partners again. One Friday evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark came home earlier than expected. He had a bottle of wine in one hand and a takeout bag from my favorite restaurant in the other. I raised an eyebrow as he stepped into the kitchen, his tie slightly loosened, and a playful grin on his face. "What's the occasion?" I asked, leaning against the counter. "No occasion," he said, setting the items down and moving closer to me. "Just wanted to do something nice for you. For us." It was a simple gesture, but it warmed me in a way that words couldn't. "Thank you," I said, smiling softly. "This means a lot." Mark reached for my hand, his touch steady and familiar. "I know I've been a lousy husband at times, Julia, but I'm trying. I really am." "I know," I said, squeezing his hand, "and I see it. It's not perfect, but it's better. We're better." His smile widened, and he leaned down to press a kiss to my forehead, a kiss that felt like a promise. Later that night, as we sat together on the couch, the quiet hum of conversation flowed easily between us. Mark asked about my day, really listening, and I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't in years. It felt like peeling back layers that had been hidden for too long, revealing pieces of myself I thought I'd lost. As we laughed about an old memory, a vacation mishap involving a missed flight and an overly ambitious itinerary, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was a text from an unknown number. "Hi, Julia. I hope this isn't crossing a line. I just wanted to say I'm glad I met you. Take care of yourself." There was no need to wonder who it was from. Nathan's words were as unmistakable as the bittersweet pang they brought. Mark noticed my hesitation. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. I hesitated, then nodded, locking my phone and setting it aside. "Yeah, just a wrong number, I think." It wasn't a lie, not entirely. Nathan's message wasn't meant to disrupt or intrude. It was a quiet farewell, a final thread tying up the loose ends of a connection that had once felt so fraught with possibility. I turned my attention back to Mark, determined to keep moving forward. "Do you remember that time we got lost in Venice and ended up in that tiny cafe?" I asked, steering the conversation back to safer, happier territory. Mark grinned. "How could I forget? You insisted we didn't need a map." I laughed, the sound genuine, and as we continued reminiscing, I felt the weight of Nathan's message begin to fade. It wasn't that he didn't matter. He had been a pivotal part of my journey, but his chapter in my life was closed now, and I was finally at peace with that. The seasons shifted again, and with the arrival of spring came a sense of renewal. Mark and I had fallen into a new rhythm, one that felt more balanced and connected. We took walks together in the evenings, cooked meals side by side, and even started planning a long overdue vacation, a chance to escape the routines that had once trapped us. One morning, as I was watering the garden, I noticed the house next door was bustling with activity. Movers were unloading furniture, and a young couple stood on the porch, chatting animatedly. The sight filled me with a strange sense of closure. Life was moving forward, as it always did. A few days later, I decided to introduce myself. Carrying a plate of cookies, I knocked on the door and was greeted by a woman with a warm smile and a toddler balanced on her hip. "Hi, I'm Julia," I said, offering the plate. "I live next door, just wanted to say welcome to the neighborhood." "Thank you so much," she said, her smile widening. "I'm Hannah, and this little one is Lily. Come in, please." I stepped inside, and as we chatted, I found myself struck by how easy it was to connect with her. She was kind, open, and full of energy. A stark contrast to the quiet, charged moments I'd once shared with Nathan. It was a reminder of how much had changed, how far I'd come. As I left their house and walked back to my own, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in a long time. The shadows of the past no longer clung to me. They had been replaced by a clarity and purpose I didn't think I'd find again. That evening, Mark and I sat on the patio, the golden hues of sunset painting the sky. I leaned into him, his arm draped comfortably around my shoulders, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For the first time in years, I wasn't yearning for something more. I wasn't searching for a spark or chasing a fleeting connection. I was here, in this moment, with the man I had chosen and who had chosen me. "Thank you," I said suddenly, my voice breaking the comfortable silence. Mark turned to me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "For what?" "For not giving up on us," I said simply. His expression softened and he kissed the top of my head. "I could say the same to you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I closed my eyes and let the warmth of his embrace envelop me. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face them. Together. The end of one chapter often marks the beginning of another, and as the stars began to emerge in the night sky, I realized that my story was far from over, but for now, I was exactly where I needed to be. The end. Would you like a summary or any specific edits to this story? He said, for resolution. ChatGPT said, goal narrative, resolution, 1,000 words. The first few weeks after Nathan left were the hardest. There was a strange emptiness in knowing he was no longer next door, no longer a quiet presence in the periphery of my life. I didn't regret my decision to draw boundaries or to focus on rebuilding my marriage, but the emotional residue of his departure lingered, like a melody I couldn't quite shake. And that Mark's renewed effort in our relationship helped. He started coming home earlier, leaving his laptop closed during dinner, and asking questions that showed he was truly listening. It felt good to reconnect, but the process was fragile, like learning to walk again after being on crutches for so long. There were still moments of awkwardness, gaps in conversation that reminded us both of the distance we'd let grow between us. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Mark surprised me by suggesting something I never thought he'd agree to. "Why don't we take a weekend away?" he asked, setting down his glass of wine. "Just the two of us. No work, no distractions." I blinked at him, caught off guard by the suggestion. "Really?" "No." He smiled, a little sheepish. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it for a while now. I know I've been absent, Julia, and I hate that. I want to fix it. I want us to feel like us again." His words touched something deep inside me, and I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I'd like that," I said softly. "I'd like that a lot." The weekend came and we packed an overnight bag and drove to a quiet bed and breakfast a couple of hours outside the city. The air was crisp, the trees just beginning to show the colors of early autumn, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were on an adventure together. The bed and breakfast was quaint, with a cozy fireplace in the lounge and a dining room that smelled of fresh bread and herbs. Our room had a small balcony overlooking a garden, and as we unpacked, I caught Mark looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen in a long time. Affection, unguarded and pure. "What?" I asked, laughing as I folded a sweater. "Nothing," he said, shaking his head with a smile. "I'm just happy to be here with you." His words warmed me, and I stepped closer, wrapping my arms around his waist. "Me too," I said, resting my head against his chest. The steady beat of his heart was a comforting rhythm, grounding me in the moment. That night, we sat by the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa and talking about everything and nothing. Mark shared stories from his childhood that I'd never heard before, and I told him about the dreams I'd put on hold when we got married, the painting classes I'd always wanted to take, the garden I'd never started. "You should do those things," he said, his tone earnest. "You've spent so much time supporting me in my career. It's time you do something for yourself." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I realized just how much I'd missed feeling truly seen by him. "Thank you," I said, my voice trembling. "That means a lot." The trip became a turning point for us. When we returned home, we carried the warmth of that weekend with us, letting it guide our efforts to rebuild our connection. Mark started joining me in the garden on Saturday mornings, even if it was just to sit and sip coffee while I worked. I signed up for a painting class at the community center, and he surprised me by framing my first finished piece and hanging it in his office. Life wasn't perfect. There were still moments of frustration and miscommunication, but there was a sense of partnership that hadn't been there before. We were trying, and that was enough. One afternoon, as I was tidying the living room, I came across an envelope tucked under the stack of mail on the counter. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the handwriting. It was from Nathan. I hesitated, unsure whether to open it. Part of me wanted to set it aside, to leave the past in the past, but curiosity and something deeper compelled me to read it. "Julia, I hope this doesn't feel like an intrusion, but I wanted to say thank you for your kindness, your honesty, and for the way you made me feel like I mattered, even if only for a little while. I've learned a lot from knowing you, about connection, about courage, and about letting go. You've left an impact on me, one I'll carry with me for a long time. I hope you and Mark find the happiness you deserve. You deserve so much, Julia. Take care." The letter was short, simple, and yet it left me sitting on the couch for a long time staring at the words. There was no regret in his tone, no bitterness, only gratitude and a quiet sense of closure. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the drawer of my desk, alongside other mementos that marked the milestones of my life. It wasn't something I needed to dwell on, but it was a part of my story, and I chose to honor it for what it was, a fleeting connection that helped me find my way back to myself. As the months passed, the house next door grew livelier. The young couple who had moved in hosted barbecues in their yard, their laughter carrying through the air like a song. I found myself smiling more often, waving to them as I watered my garden or walked to the mailbox. Life was moving forward, and I was finally ready to embrace it. One evening, as Mark and I sat on the patio watching the sunset, he reached for my hand and laced his fingers through mine. Do you ever think about where we were a year ago? He asked, his voice low. All the time, I admitted, turning to look at him. And I think about how far we've come. He smiled, his gaze steady. I'm proud of us, Julia, for not giving up. Me too, I said, squeezing his hand. We've earned this. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and pink, I leaned into him, letting the warmth of his presence fill the spaces that had once felt so empty. The road hadn't been easy, but it had led us here, to a place of hope, of connection, and of quiet, enduring love. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole.